Denise, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. Renowned ranter, I think, is probably nearer their cause. So I'm going to take you through a study which uses the IPA Databank as to give us our lens on effectiveness. As many of you know, the IPA Databank is formed from the collected confidential business effects data, particularly that is submitted alongside the case studies to the IPA effectiveness competition. We're looking here at 2 years, 2012 and 2014, the latest available, because we have to make this contemporary and current. Now, what the IPA Databank enables us to do is to examine how inputs, in this case media selections, influence outcomes, and in this case we're looking at business effects. So it enables us to, in this case, examine a bunch of case studies that did make use of news brands in various ways, compare them with a bunch of case studies that didn't use news brands at all or in various ways, and to look at what the impact of that is on the kind of business effectiveness. There aren't vast volumes of data over just this 2012-2014 period, but it's the quality of the raw data we get out of the IPA Databank that I think makes it particularly valuable. Okay, so let's get into the study. There were 3 key questions that I was asked to look at when we went into this analysis. The first is, can we find any evidence from amongst the IPA data that there is an impact on broad effectiveness from the use of news brands? And we'll look at print and we'll look at online separately, though we're not going to break online down in the same way that James just did. So can we find some hard evidence from hard business effects that suggests that news brands use is good for business? Secondly, we're going to look at this business of multi-platform, although in the case of my analysis it's really dual platform. Can we establish whether the use of one news brand medium, be it print or online, brings less benefit than the use of both together, print and online? You've just seen some powerful evidence that using the two together has big impacts on brand effects. Can we similarly show that the use of two together has a bigger impact on business effects than one in isolation? So we're going to do that. And then the third objective of this study is to say that in a multi-channel world, can we look for... Channels very, very rarely work in isolation, almost never work in isolation. So actually, perhaps the most important question to ask is, how do news brands media sit alongside some of the big popular media that many campaigns use out there? Can we establish, if you like, that it is a good citizen in the effectiveness world of multi-channel media? Now, we'll take you through the data in a moment, but I'll just give you the kind of summary of the findings up front, so that if any of you are starting to feel a little weary in the morning, you can always nip on out and go and get a cup of coffee. So the first is that, yes, we did find some very, very significant, and in the context of IPA data, these are very powerful uplifts to effectiveness that stem from news brands usage, and we'll look at some of those. You would expect that, having seen the last presentation. We do find this, in absolute parallel to James' work, we do find this multiplier effect at work, where the use of both platforms, online and print, is very considerably more powerful than the use of one in isolation. So we're seeing that multiplier at work, and it'll be interesting to explore, to some extent, the reasons perhaps behind that. And thirdly, we're going to look at what we're going to see some data for is we've looked at how news brands media can enhance the impact of TV, being the most popular medium in this particular database, also social, and then other online display tools that we have available. So we're going to look at how it impacts on those three, and what we're going to find is it has big uplifts on all of those three, one in particular, which I'll come to when we get to it. So let's just take one step back. I just wanted to reassure you about the methodology, give you some basic background to the study so that you don't think that this is all a bunch of lunatic analysis. So let's have a look at the methodology and definitions and sample sizes. So what we're doing here is, with all media, there is a long tail to usage. And in fact, in this particular database, there are very, very few complete non-users of news brands media. And you can correctly infer from that there must be some link between it and effectiveness, because we're looking at a world of effectiveness here. So we can't look at complete non-users. But fortunately, there is this very long tail to usage. So we're setting a threshold, which is, in fact, 8% of budget. And anything below that we're going to say is a non or light user, and anything above is going to be what I would call a power user. There's nothing particularly magical about 8%. It has two benefits. One is it corresponds with a reasonable budget level, which most of you would consider to be a reasonable level of commitment to the medium from which we might hope to find reasonable results. But also, conveniently from my point of view as the analyst here, it roughly speaking divides the sample in two. So I've got reasonable samples of power users and light and non-users. Similar thing applies to online, lower threshold, 0.01% of budget, but again, it enables me to look at power users and non-users and have reasonable numbers in both camps. So strictly speaking here, as I've said, we're not comparing users with non-users, we're comparing power users with light and non or perhaps passing users. And it's fair to say that there are a fair number of case studies in the IPA Databank where the use of newsbrands and print in particular was in some sense tactical. So it's very low level and we would not expect to find any significant impacts from it. So we're stripping those out there in the non or light user bunch. We've got 76 case studies. This is not a big number of case studies, so we're going to have to be very, very careful about reassuring ourselves that when we compare users and non-users, that we are comparing like with like to some extent, that we have some kind of level playing field that we're going to look at. But just to let you know, this is how it breaks down. We have, roughly speaking, similar numbers of case studies in all of the key user, non-user groups. And we've got total newsbrands users amongst that sample of 55 with non-users 21. But we've got reasonably even samples. Now, I said it was very important that we can be confident when we compare users and non-users that we have something approaching a level playing field. And unfortunately, of course, it's Sod's law. This always happens to me whenever I get anywhere near the IPA Databank. Sod's law comes into play. It is not a level playing field, anything but. Users of newsbrands media in this particular database have an enormous disadvantage versus non-users, and that comes from 5 different areas. Most important is that they are campaigns that are generally underfunded. They have very low budgets, measured in terms of ESOV, extra share of voice. Those who've heard me talk about this will know this is the difference between our share of voice across all media and our share of market. And that is the important metric that drives growth, for all sorts of very, very sensible reasons. If we have high ESOV, we should expect good growth, and if we have low ESOV, we should not. And the difference in percentage points between print, particularly print users, and non-users is around about, it's just short of 10 percentage points of ESOV. That's a huge budget difference, massive. So frankly, it would be irrational to the point of plain barking to imagine that we should be getting similar levels of effectiveness out of newsbrands users than non-users, and the fact that we're going to get superior levels is a truly astonishing finding. But we're going to try and analyse our way around that particular pain in the arse when we come to some of my shortly appearing charts. We have a second problem in the analysis, which is that newsbrands users, and this is a grotesque piece of miscasting of the medium, are more likely to be short-term case studies. By short-term, I mean designed to work over periods of less than 6 months, typically within the quarter. We live in a short-term world. And those of you who've heard me rant about this before, and I rant about it regularly, will know that the problem with short-term campaigns is that they are very, very considerably less effective in general than long-term campaigns, particularly obviously over the long term, but because they are not designed and do not have time to drive these all-important brand effects that James talked about, they just don't play out in effectiveness terms remotely as strongly. And we've got an almost 10 percentage points disadvantage in terms of the proportion of case studies for newsbrands users that were short-term. It's another huge pain in the arse when it comes to analysis. 2 really big disadvantages. There are 3 others. Newsbrand users are more likely to be new or small brands. They have an effectiveness disadvantage. They are more likely to come from the value or mainstream end of the market as opposed to the premium end. And again, that creates its own problems for effectiveness. And then lastly, but by no means least, they are quite significantly less likely to have adopted an emotional campaign strategy. And again, those of you who've heard me rant about this as well will know that emotional campaigns play out much more strongly in terms of long-term effectiveness. And we're looking here at long-term effectiveness metrics. That's the real value of the IPA Databank, is we can strip out all of that short-term nonsense that we're being relentlessly bombarded with and look at what plays out over the long term. And emotional campaigns are an important part of that, and the fact that our campaigns are less likely to be emotional is another disadvantage. We've got these 5 big significant disadvantages. We've only got one advantage to set against it, which is the fact that newsbrands case studies were more likely to be drawn from services and to some extent durables, less likely to come from packaged goods. And given that services and durables are more responsive to advertising, that is a positive advantage. But you don't need me to tell you don't need a mathematician to tell you that the balance of advantage and disadvantage is heavily against newsbrands media. So we do not have a level playing field. And when we look at the kind of head measures, the basic measures of effectiveness, we shouldn't be expecting to see any advantage for newsbrands users over non-users. So let's get into the data. Enough of that. So here we are looking at business effects. This is broad business effects. We're looking at the print users of print, newsbrands print. So what we find, we have a broad basket of metrics that we can examine, the long-term metrics, and what we find is that the users of newsbrands print drive 36% greater large uplifts across the range of metrics that we have. The number of business metrics that shift is 36% greater. Now that, of course, has inbuilt to it this enormous disadvantage. It's an extremely impressive figure in the context of this database. There are not many media who through use or non-use can boast of this kind of level of difference. TV is obviously one of them, and there are others. But an awful lot of the media channels that we look at on the IPA Databank are either indiscernible with their impact on effectiveness through use or non-use. Some of them, which will remain nameless, even have a negative impact on effectiveness. You'll have to get me very drunk to reveal what they are. So first of all, let's take out the effect of budget. Let's try and do that. So let's look at the impact of print, where we are looking only at larger brands. So these are brand leaders or significant challengers in the markets. Now I'm doing this simply because it happens that the ESOV levels are pretty similar between users and non-users. There's a slight disadvantage to users, but it's nothing very much to worry about. So what happens? Our all cases situation of 36% is my number that you're going to get very familiar with, different from James's. 36% is our baseline. What happens when we only look at larger brands? We see an enormous uplift, and I would suggest to you that that is a more realistic measure of the impact of newsbrands print on effectiveness, because we've taken out this critical issue of budget. I also said that the other major thorn in my flesh in this analysis was the issue of short-termism and how short-termism is really pernicious when it comes to effectiveness. The easy and obvious way to deal with that is to simply ignore the short-term case studies and only look at long-term case studies, those that were over periods of more than 6 months. So this is our baseline figure again, 36%. What we find is if we only look at long-term case studies, again, there is an enormous rise, 62% in this case, very similar to the last one. And I'm going to again suggest to you that that is probably a more realistic assessment of the impact of newsbrands usage, print usage, on effectiveness. Now these, as I say, are very significant numbers in the context of this database. These are really worthwhile. This particular metric correlates with return on investment and a number of other important metrics. So it is a real improvement to the business success of campaigns. Okay, so that is question 1 dealt with. Let's have a look at question 2 here. So let's see what happens when we combine print and news together. And what we see here is that compared to our previous baseline number of about 36%, we find that we have a much bigger uplift now. When we combine those two channels, those two platforms, we find that the number rises to 58%. So that is a very, very significant uplift indeed. Now, it is often said that, to some extent, we know that about these multipliers and we know how important they are. But let's just subdivide that now, because actually the value in this is not the headline number of plus 58%, which is very impressive in itself. It's the pattern of effects that I think I want to draw your attention to. So we're going to look here, we're going to disassemble that into the constituent metrics. We're going to look at sales, which can be short-term, and sometimes is. Market share, which is almost universally a long-term metric. It's measured over typically periods of a year. Price sensitivity, only ever a long-term metric. You cannot shift price sensitivity in the short term. Loyalty, customer acquisition, and of course the one that really matters, profit. So let's spare the drama, let's just punch up the numbers, and you can see how multi-platform users versus non-users play out across those various different metrics. Now, I just want to draw your attention to a number of things. Firstly, that the market share uplift is very, very significantly greater than the general sales uplift, because sales uplifts can be short-term. So what this is suggesting to us is that newsbrand users are playing in the long-term arena. They are fishing in the pool of long-term effectiveness, if you like. And this is hugely important to their role in multi-channel platforms these days. We have so many media at our disposal that have been honed and refined for short-term effects that we really need these channels that can actually work over the long term. Price sensitivity, exactly the same picture. As I said to you, this is only influenceable over the long term. Only media and campaigns that are designed to work over the long term ever shift price sensitivity. So the fact that there is this actually enormous, I mean, we never get big numbers for this because it's such a difficult metric to shift. That is a huge difference. We also drive customer acquisition very powerfully. Customer acquisition. Any of those of you who are familiar with the work of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute and Byron Sharp in particular will know that if we don't drive customer acquisition, we don't succeed as a brand. Bringing in new customers is the absolutely vital prerequisite of effectiveness. So this is a really, really important number, it turns out. So what you see on this chart is we have the holy trinity of effects that drive profitability. We have market share growth, long-term market share growth. We have significant improvements to price sensitivity stemming from the use of newsbrands media. And we have very, very significant uplifts to customer acquisition. All three of those are responsible for the impressive profit metric shifts that we're seeing here. But again, it's a big shift. Those of you who are also familiar with Ehrenberg Bass will know that loyalty comes from growth. It is not a driver of growth. So in a sense, it's the least important metric here. But with these kinds of impressive shifts in customer acquisition and share growth, you would expect an improvement to loyalty. And we're seeing that too. So it's a very consistent picture across the board of very impressive improvements to metrics. Okay, so that's two questions dealt with. Let's move on to the third question, which is how do newsbrands sit alongside these key media? And the first one we're looking at here is TV. TV, of course, is a very challenging medium to sit alongside because it sets a pretty high effectiveness bar to start with. It's a very effective medium, as I'm sure you all know. So being able to demonstrate that in combination with TV, you make any major impact to effectiveness is actually very difficult, and few media pull it off. But you're seeing here a very, very significant impact on the broad effectiveness metric, the number of business effects that very large business effects we generate, coming from the use of dual platform newsbrands media, print and online, plus 65%. That is pretty effective. Now, I think the link between TV and print has been established over many years. It's quite well known. It's been honed and refined. So just in case any of you think that this is only down to that, let's just take a look at what happens where we only couple TV with online newsbrands. And we actually see a very, very similar uplift. I mean, within the statistical accuracy of this study, there is no real difference between those two. So it's clear that it's not just the print synergy with TV that's working, it's also online synergy. That may work in slightly different ways. I'd be amazed if it didn't, and the suggestion in the data is it probably does work in slightly different ways. But the two of them are each pulling their own weight in this picture of powerful uplifts alongside TV. And worth pausing for a moment on this and just to make one point, that the equivalent uplift for other display media used alongside TV is about a quarter of that. It's about 16%. So what this is saying to us is that there is something very special, something very effective about the environment and perhaps the intangibles of audience, quality and reach that we get through this particular display medium. That not all online display mediums are born equal in this world. And this is something I really think, I'll come back to this later, we really need to remember. Okay, let's move forward to some of the two other media we looked at, versus other online display with no newsbrands. So how do we enhance online display as a medium. So you would expect there to be quite a big uplift from this, from what I have just said. And indeed, if we team other forms of online display with news brands, we get a 53% uplift in this particular business effectiveness metric. So that's pretty significant and pretty useful. But actually more interesting to me, because one of my particular obsessions here, is the impact we have on social. And I think there's a growing body of evidence, case study evidence out there, that suggests that social really needs other, particularly established media to work at its best, that it's more of a reinforcement or a multiplier medium than a lead medium on its own. And you're seeing that really powerfully here, because we more than double the effectiveness of social when we team it with news brands, media, online and print. It really needs that multi-channel support. And again, this is not, of course, what we're told within these walled gardens of effectiveness that increasingly we see. Okay, so time for a wrap. Let me just give you 4 obvious conclusions from this and then 2 broader conclusions that I want to draw from it. The first is that, as you've seen, there is strong evidence in this study that echoes the previous study that suggests that the use of news brands, print and online, in their own right, widely enhance effectiveness when included in the media mix, and that those effects are broad and they are long-term and they are not simply transient effects. So they're valuable for long-term effectiveness. Secondly, that we have these multi-platform multipliers, which you would expect. If both the media are effective, then using them in an integrated sense in conjunction with one another ought to generate multipliers. And you've seen some pretty big multipliers at work there. So 2 is better than 1. And we've also seen some particularly important uplifts in terms of how news brands media can influence other important media. We saw big uplifts even with TV. We saw huge uplifts with social, which again, personally, I'm not surprised at. And then the last of these 4 narrow conclusions is that the pattern of effects is exactly what we would want in this modern short-termist world if we are going to stand any chance of remedying the toxic issue of short-term metrics. Because what the use of news brands does is it generates long-term effects. It generates profit built on these all 3 pillars, the holy trinity, if you like, of drivers of profit. That is to say, market share growth, penetration growth, and price elasticity reductions. So it is a really powerful media measured by that particular test. And there are not many that can punch powerfully in all of those particular areas. And then I just want to draw 2 broader conclusions, which are kind of personal obsessions of mine. Firstly, what this really demonstrates, this study, it's the latest in a series, a number of studies that have come out in recent years, that shows the absolute folly of those who would suggest to you that the future of effectiveness is a uniquely digital affair. It is total rubbish. We see here classically what we see in study after study, that actually the best effectiveness is driven by the combination of the best of the new and the old, and that legacy media, in this case print, still have an enormously powerful role to play in effectiveness. So that's general point 1. General point 2 is that we've seen here that not all display media, online display media, are born equal. And again, I think it is a ludicrous world where we trade online media inventory like pork bellies. I mean, it's daft. It's absolutely daft. There is clearly qualitative benefits in the environment and the nature of the audience and the way the audience interacts with messages that stem in certain areas, particularly news brands. And in an era, I should say, of ad blocking and all the rest of it, I think these kinds of qualitative environmental effects are only going to get more and more important. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening. I'll take any questions if I'm allowed.
Jess Burley, M6. I have 2 questions for you, actually. The first one, we have evidence of a similar result in terms of the combination of digital media combined with print media driving for acquisition. So that absolutely rings true. I guess my question is, from the data that you've seen, have you could you extrapolate a case that says print media combined with digital media driving into digital? So as we see the penetration of retail extend online, or activation in app online, etc., could you extrapolate that?
You're
from the
going
data?
to have to watch this space, and we're working on that. My colleague Les Binet and I are working on these kinds of issues, and there will be more news specifically on that from this data source over the coming year. So I can't really answer that now.
Okay. The reason I ask the question is I have a hunch that it's a massive part of how print plays into driving into digital, but it would be great if we could prove it.
I would be surprised if you weren't right, absolutely. But I don't have the evidence to prove it now. But
Can I
think
have a second question?
Yeah.
I know it's a bit cheeky. So second question is, on your acquisition of customers point, could you extrapolate whether that was a combination of brand creative as well as promotional creative?
Okay, so a very good question, and we can't be precise about this because what we don't have is a record of how the media that we're looking at here were used. But we do know from going through the case studies to the extent that we can that the majority of it is brand and not promotional. Particularly that's going to be the case with the power users. I think the lighter and non-users, the ones that use it for small budget, they will tend to have used it in more of a promotional short-term way. So I think customer acquisition is being driven through brand measures. And you would expect that because again, this is essentially a long-term metric here. And the thing about short-term use, tactical and promotional use, is it can drive customer acquisition, but it tends to be short-term. These tend to be transient blips that don't register hugely over the long term. And very often the blips evaporate shortly afterwards because somebody else has done exactly the same thing. So yes, I'm pretty confident that this is principally coming through from brands. You've heard me try to echo the previous studies, so that my belief here, although we don't really have the detailed data to prove it in this study, my belief is that the pattern of effects that I have demonstrated to you is entirely consistent with brand-driven growth and brand-building effects coming from the use of the medium, particularly print, I would suggest.
Thanks.
Hi, Peter. Simon Redican from the Publishers Audience Measurement Company. Given that the IPA Databank represents some of the sort of best planning that you get in the market, what do you think your analysis tells us about the current state of the quality of planning of news brand campaigns?
Now I have to be very careful what I say here, don't I? I mean, I think I've hinted at this in that I think, we live in a world where we're bombarded with digital hype and propaganda. And that hype and propaganda has kind of led us to take a view about the value of print in particular, and has persuaded a lot of people, I think, that it is not as valuable as it genuinely is. So I think what we've seen particularly is that print has been harnessed to this short-term agenda, which I think is complete miscasting. So people see it as perhaps it's kind of activation for the oldies amongst us, I don't know, there are lots of ways in which it is used inappropriately. So I don't think that a lot of the planning around particularly the use of print is truly objective and truly informed. I think it's been led by this digital agenda of received wisdom about effectiveness, which I think is misleading a lot of people in a lot of ways. So I would say I think we all need to get back to the facts. We need to get back to the kinds of studies that Newsworks have been doing here and actually examine the true pattern of effectiveness that the use of the medium can generate. And the evidence of this analysis is that actually it's a powerful brand-building medium, print in particular. So the harnessing of it to short-term sales agenda is inappropriate, it's not smart, it's not using it in its best way, and we should perhaps revisit all of this. But is that an answer to your question? Or
yeah, absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Ian Gibbs from The Guardian. Obviously, there's a great case for news brands here, but just the sort of effectiveness findings aside, the fact that a print user is defined as someone who devotes 8% of budget to the medium and a digital user is someone who devotes 0.01%. I mean, is that a story in itself? And given the way our audiences have and will transition, does that sort of encapsulate the challenge that we face? It's
a good question. It's a very good question. I mean, it's a huge spectrum, Spencer, and I wouldn't attach too much significance to the 0.01. The fact is there are case studies here that spent very significant amounts on digital. It just happened that that's where the cut-off point lay, that divided it. But very long tail, clearly, in the same way, a lot of people using it in passing sense. But I think you're right in one big sense, that it is assumed these days that we should use digital, unquestionably. Whereas use of print is somehow increasingly seen as a little quaint, perhaps, and I don't know, perhaps we'd need some kind of justification for it. Now, this data just simply doesn't back that up at all. I mean, it has just as powerful a role. So perhaps there is a significance in the 8% that we had to kind of raise the bar that high to really look for the power users, and actually perhaps the spread. I mean, it would have been a very, very boring chart to put up, but I should have put up the distribution spread of share of percentage of budget. And I think you would have seen from that, like I said, this very long tail of people who are using print in passing ways, perhaps tactical or whatever, or to support some promotion or trade initiative or whatever. And I think they are misunderstanding the really important and valuable use of the medium, which is as a consumer brand building tool.